Hi, boys and girls. I'm so excited for this week's numeracy lesson. Let's begin. Let's start off this lesson with some quick thinking maths. 10 minus 4 is 6. 17 minus 2 is 15. 15 minus 3 is 12. 16 minus 12 is 4. 13 minus 5 is 8. And 18 minus 7 is 11. Well done if you got those correct. Today we are looking at subtraction with borrowing. Here are some other words that we can use when doing a subtraction sum. Subtract, minus, deduct, take away. They all mean the same thing. Let's have a look at the steps we take in order to tackle a subtraction sum. Remember that your bigger number always comes first. You cannot subtract a bigger number from a smaller number. You can only subtract a smaller number from a bigger number. Step number 1, we subtract the units. Step number 2, we subtract the tens. Step number 3, we subtract the hundreds. Sometimes you need to borrow. This is when you take from your neighbor. We will have a look at some of these examples. Let's have a look at this example. 494 minus 173. Step number 1, you minus your units. 4 minus 3 equals 1. Step number 2, you minus your tens. 9 minus 7 is 2. And step number 3, you minus your hundreds. 4 minus 1 is 3. So your answer is 321. Our next example says 592 minus 331. Step number 1, you minus your units. 2 minus 1 is 1. Step number 2, you minus your tens. 9 minus 3 is 6. And step number 3, you minus your hundreds. 5 minus 3 is 2. So our answer is 261. Now let's have a look at this example. 692 minus 476. Step number 1, you subtract your units. 2 minus 6, that we cannot do. Now this is where we are going to borrow. We need to borrow from our neighbor because we do not have enough for ourselves. So our neighbor takes 1 away from themselves, the 9 becomes an 8, and they lend that 1 to us. So now our 2 became a 12. We can now say, what is 12 minus 6? 6. Step number 2, you subtract your tens. What is 8 minus 7? 1. And step number 3, you subtract your hundreds. What is 6 minus 4? 2. So our answer is 216. You can see there that we borrowed from our neighbor because we did not have enough for ourselves. Our next example says 974 minus 259. Step number 1, you minus your units. 4 minus 9, we cannot do. So we have to go next door to borrow. Our 7 becomes a 6, and we carry our 1 over. Our 4 now becomes a 14. So we can say 14 minus 9 equals 5. Step number 2 is minus your tens. 6 minus 5 is 1. And our last step is minus your hundreds. 9 minus 2 is 7. So our answer is 715. Our next example says 361 minus 145. Step number 1 is minus your units. 1 minus 5 we cannot do, so we need to borrow from next door. Our 6 becomes a 5. We can now carry our 1 over. Our 1 becomes an 11. So now we can say 11 minus 5 equals 6. Step number 2 is minus your tens. 5 minus 4 is 1. And lastly, we need to minus our hundreds. 3 minus 1 is 2. So our answer is 216. Let's have a look at our last example. 743 minus 234. Step number 1, you subtract your units. 3 minus 4, we cannot do. So once again, we need to go to our neighbor to borrow. Our 4 now becomes a 3, and they lend us the 1. So our 3 becomes a 13. What is 13 minus 4? 9. Step number 2, you subtract your tens. 3 minus 3 is 0. And step number 3, you subtract your hundreds. 7 minus 2 is 5. So our answer is 509. It is now activity time. This is what you'll need for today's activity. Either you need the math sheet that was sent out. If you were not able to print that, then you can just use a normal piece of paper and write down your answers on the paper, and a pencil. This is our activity for today. It is a worksheet on subtraction. If you are unable to print the worksheet, it is okay. Simply do the sums on a separate piece of paper. The top part are normal subtraction sums. The bottom part has borrowing, so work carefully. Enjoy your activity and try your best. I can't wait for next week.